Have you ever wondered what truly happens when a woman no longer craves to be touched? Not out of pain, not out of numbness, but because something far deeper has begun to stir within her. In a world that measures a woman's worth by how much she is desired, silence in the body is often mistaken for emptiness, failure, or emotional withdrawal. But what if that silence is not a void, but a threshold? What if it is not absence, but a sacred beginning? A quiet rebellion against everything superficial. A soft, invisible revolution unfolding from the inside out. When a woman chooses consciously or unconsciously to step away from the noise of validation, to remove herself from the endless performance of attraction and attachment, she creates space for something ancient to return. This is not about repression. It is about transmutation. About energy, once scattered outward, now turning inward, transforming into the intuition awareness and profound presence. The world may fear the woman who no longer seeks to be chosen, who no longer needs to be touched to feel alive, because she becomes unpredictable, magnetic, untouchable. She begins to see through illusions, through the repetition of empty patterns, through the masks that love often wears. And in that silence, what the world calls a void, her soul begins to speak its first true words. Carl Jung might call this a meeting with the shadow, a turning point where a woman no longer waits to be chosen, but begins to choose herself. She no longer loves in order to be loved. She loves herself with such depth and conviction that the need for superficial connection simply falls away. There is a kind of silence that has nothing to do with absence. It is not hollow. It is holy. It is a temple built within. And when the body becomes still, when desire quiets down, and the outer world fades into the background, it is often because something sacred inside is preparing to awaken. A fire that cannot be seen, but that can be deeply felt. A woman who lives without sex or relationships is not empty. On the contrary, she may be more alive, more awake, more deeply rooted in herself than ever before. What looks like detachment from the outside is often a profound intimacy with her own being. What seems like loneliness is actually communion, a union with something no external touch could ever reach. In that sacred space, something ancient begins to stir. The wild woman awakens not as a fantasy or symbol, but as a real living force. She is the part of the feminine that remembers, that listens, that no longer performs for approval. She moves not to be seen, but because she feels the pulse of truth rising from her core. Can you feel that stirring within yourself? That subtle ache for something more real, more raw, more rooted than the shallow highs and scripted affections we've been sold? That feeling is not confusion. It's a calling. And no, it's not for everyone, or it's for the woman who is tired of trading her essence for a fleeting sense of belonging. For the woman who knows that what she is really searching for will not be found in someone else's bed, but in the sacred mirror of her own soul. If you're still listening, if these words are finding a quiet echo in your chest, perhaps you are already closer to that journey than you realize. Yes, the body falls silent, but that silence is not surrender. It is not weakness. It is strength being reclaimed. It is wisdom that no longer wants to be wasted. It is a kind of retreat, not to disappear, but to return more whole, more unshakable, more powerful than before. Because once the soul begins to speak, there is no turning back. A woman who has heard the voice of her own soul can never again be satisfied by the low hum of ordinary love. There comes a moment in every woman's life when the noise becomes unbearable. Not the noise of the outside world, but the subtler, more dangerous noise within. The inherited expectations, the artificial desires she was conditioned to feel, the beliefs about affection that were never really hers to begin with. And it is in that invisible exhaustion, the kind no one else sees, that the return begins. The journey home to herself. Carl Jung once said that everything we refuse to face within ourselves eventually returns as fate. Perhaps that is why when a woman's body chooses stillness, when it no longer reaches, no longer chases it, should not be seen as a failure. It is not a collapse. It is a signal that something deeper is preparing to surface. When a woman begins to pull away from the impulses that once guided her, even without knowing exactly why, it means she has started to hear something. A quiet summons that does not rise from the body, but from the soul. A kind of homesickness emerges, subtle, unnamed. But it is not for a man, not for a lover's touch or a night of passion. It is a longing for herself, for a place she has never been, but somehow knows is real. In this light, abstinence is no longer a form of deprivation. It becomes a doorway, a threshold into the sacred. And as she walks through it, she begins what Jung called the journey of individuation, a radical return to wholeness. She steps out of the illusions, out of the projections she once cast onto others, and begins to truly see herself. The emptiness that shows up is not a void. It is a sacred clearing, a space being carved open so that something more real, more aligned, can take root. And within that space, memories return with a different kind of ache. No longer wounds that sting, but messages waiting to be understood. Past relationships, tear-stained nights, and endless emotional cycles once clouded in confusion begin to reveal their hidden meaning. The pain starts to organize itself. The pieces begin to fit. Not because anything has changed on the outside, but because she is now seeing everything from within. The woman who surrenders to silence is not giving up on life. She is learning to narrate her story from the voice of her soul, not her suffering. Slowly, she learns to observe her emotions with reverence, as if they are symbols sent from a deeper realm, mirrors reflecting the truths that her unconscious had always tried to speak, but which were drowned out by the noise of desire. And in this sacred quiet, something extraordinary happens. She realizes she no longer needs applause, no longer needs to be touched to feel valuable. Her worth is no longer tied to how desirable her body appears, but to how fully she can remain in the presence of her own spirit, without flinching. From this depth, a nearly mystical force begins to rise, the kind of power that cannot be faked or borrowed. The power of a woman who no longer needs to be chosen. And this is where the world grows uneasy. Because society doesn't know how to respond to a woman who no longer begs to be loved. She is no longer seeking permission to exist. She is whole. And because she is whole, she becomes a threat to everything that still lives, fragmented. She becomes a mirror to the incomplete and a reminder of the sacred work that most are still too afraid to begin. And then, slowly, she begins to understand her vital energy isn't gone. It's simply been withdrawn, pulled inward, protected, waiting. And as she steps into this quiet space, she enters a new kind of consciousness. A space without urgency, without the need to prove anything. Because the silence of her body is not a punishment. It is a language, a sacred dialect that can only be understood by those brave enough to dwell in their own depths. Carl Jung might call this the beginning of a reconciliation with the feminine unconscious, a return to ancient symbols buried under centuries of repression. And this reconciliation does not come through explanations or analysis. It arrives through presence, through being, through breath and stillness and surrender. This woman is just beginning to emerge, but the path is anything but soft. There is a hidden ache that sets in, a quiet unease that begins to gnaw at her spirit from the inside. Because to step away from desire, from touch, from the warmth of another body beside hers, is to step away from everything that once gave her a sense of belonging. What's left at first is a raw discomfort, an eerie sense that she has become invisible to the world, that by exiting the game of seduction, she has somehow ceased to exist. Jung would say she is now meeting the shadow. This is the part of her that lived in performance, that played the role, that sought approval, that was shaped by adaptation and thirsted for validation. And now, it refuses to keep pretending. It no longer wants to be chosen. It wants to be real. This is the moment she begins to question everything. She wonders if she made a mistake walking away, if she's losing her mind, if she's wasting time, youth opportunities, because the world tells her she must move fast. That time is short, that a woman must always be wanted, always be achieving, always fulfilling a script. And suddenly, she doesn't fit any of it anymore. She's not the lover. She's not the muse. She's not the girlfriend or the wife. She's just herself. And that ache cuts deeper than abandonment. At this point, abstinence begins to feel like exile. But it's not. It's initiation, a spiritual trial that only those with soul stamina can withstand. Temptation returns. Familiar patterns knock gently, seductively. Old invitations resurface, safe, familiar, easy. The world tests her again and again. And the cruelest part, no one around her understands. Friends suggest she go out more. Family thinks she's isolating. But she's not. She's not retreating. She's immersing, diving deep while the rest of the world drifts across the surface. Jung saw this stage as inevitable in the process of individuation, the moment when the ego begins to panic, when the identity she once relied on starts to dissolve, and the soul softly starts to take the lead. It is in this silent despair that most people give up. They go back. They choose the familiar over the unknown. They settle for lukewarm love. They tell themselves that something, anything, is better than nothing. But the woman who stays through the tears, through the doubts, through the aching quiet, she is being shaped by something far greater than she can yet name. She is not being broken. She is being initiated. She is being asked to break the cycle not through resistance, but through awareness. Not with force, but with clarity. The tension she feels is not wrong. It is sacred. Just as the cocoon tightens before the butterfly is born, so too does her soul press against the walls of her old life. Something is being gestated in the darkness, something radiant, something irreversible. And deep down she knows, even if she cannot explain it, even if she fears she is too alone, too misunderstood, too much, there is a presence she can't name but feels, a voice that doesn't shout but insists. That quiet presence is the archetypal feminine itself, the timeless bridge, as Jung wrote, between the conscious self and the mystery beyond it. And the more she leans into that internal dialogue, the more she begins to understand her body isn't on pause. It's in ceremony, a sacred ritual the modern world forgot, but one her soul never stopped remembering. And then something shifts, almost imperceptibly. A new understanding blooms, and she realizes she was never disappearing. She was becoming. What once felt like restlessness now begins to transform into deeper, more honest questions. Why have I always needed to feel desired in order to feel alive? Why does the absence of another feel like a wound? What part of me still needs to be seen in order to believe that I exist? These questions don't arise from weakness. They emerge in the stillness. In the sacred silence, a woman begins to keep when she chooses to no longer be moved by the need for attention. Because the woman who turns inward isn't retreating from life. She's rewriting her story from an entirely new vantage point. Her inner self begins to observe her emotions not as flaws to fix, but as symbols, mirrors of a deeper truth. Mirrors of an unconscious that had been whispering to her all along, but which she couldn't hear over the clamor of craving and performance. And little by little, she discovers something radical. She no longer needs applause, no longer needs to be touched, noticed, or adored to know her own worth. Her value is no longer measured by how many desire her body, but by how deeply she can remain with her own soul in silence. It is in that stillness that something mystical begins to take form. The birth of a new kind of power. The power of a woman who no longer needs to be chosen. And it's here, right here, where the world begins to fear her. Because she no longer plays the game. She no longer begs for love. She is whole. And wholeness is threatening to a world built on fragments. When she realizes that her energy is not lost, but simply gathered, pooled like deep water waiting to rise, she enters a different kind of consciousness. A way of being where there is no rush, no need to explain, no desire to prove anything. Because the silence of her body is not absence. It is not punishment. It is a language. And that language can only be understood by those who dare to descend into themselves. Carl Jung would call this a reconciliation with the feminine unconscious, a sacred return to symbols long buried under centuries of denial. Symbols that don't speak in sentences, but in sensations. They don't respond to logic, but to presence. And that woman, the one stepping into the unknown, is only just beginning to emerge. But her emergence is not without pain. Restlessness returns, but this time it isn't frantic. It is quiet and consuming. A hidden anguish that no one else can see, but that gnaws at her spirit. Because to step away from desire, to detach from touch, from validation, from the comfort of another body nearby, is to also detach from everything that once made her feel like she belonged. And what remains at first is brutal discomfort, as if the world has forgotten she exists, as if by exiting the game, she's made herself invisible. Jung would say, this is the beginning of the shadow's return. The part of her that once lived for validation, adapted to expectations, survived through performance. And now, that part refuses to pretend. It rises, it speaks, it demands truth. This is when she starts to question herself. Did I make a mistake by walking away? Am I wasting my time, my youth, my beauty, my chances? Because the world screams at her that a woman's time is short, that she must move, must chase, must conquer, must be desired, must fulfill her role. And suddenly, she finds herself nowhere in that script. She is not the lover. She is not the wife. She is not the muse nor the girlfriend. She is simply herself. And that she realizes hurts more than being left. because now she's the one who left the system. At this point, abstinence starts to feel like punishment. But it is not. It is a rite of passage, a symbolic threshold that only souls prepared for transformation can endure. Temptations return, familiar patterns, knock soft invitations appear. Everything conspires to pull her back. And the hardest part, no one understands. Friends question her. Family urges her to go out more, to live a little. They think she is isolating. But she's not. This is not isolation. It is immersion. Not everyone can witness a woman diving deep while the rest of the world floats across the surface. Jung saw this as an essential phase of individuation, the moment when the ego begins to panic, because it senses it is no longer in charge, and the soul begins to rise from the quiet. Not with force, but with grace. Not loudly, but undeniably. It is in that silent despair that many give up. They turn back. They surrender to what's familiar. They choose lukewarm love. They convince themselves that a half-life is better than none. But the woman who stays, the woman who cries through it, questions it, endures it. She is being shaped by something larger than herself. She is not falling apart. She is breaking open. She is being summoned to break the cycle. And cycles are not broken by force, but by awareness. The tension she feels is not a mistake. It is transition. Just as the cocoon tightens before the butterfly is born, something new is taking shape within her, quietly forming in the stillness. Deep down, even if she cannot name it, she knows. Even if she fears being too alone, too misunderstood, or too deep for this world, there is a quiet voice that never stops. It does not shout, but it insists. A presence that does not appear but is always near. That presence is the symbol of the archetypal feminine, the anima that Jung described as the sacred bridge between consciousness and mystery. It is with this energy that the woman begins to converse not with words, but with presence. The deeper this silent dialogue grows, the more she understands. Her body is not frozen. It is engaged in a ritual forgotten by the modern world, but one her soul has always known by heart. Then, almost imperceptibly, something shifts. A new clarity begins to bloom. The restlessness she once felt now crystallizes into deeper, more honest questions. Why have I always needed to be desired in order to feel alive? Why does the absence of another feel so unbearable? What part of me still feeds on someone else's gaze just to feel real? But the woman who has transformed no longer accepts relationships as a form of anesthesia. She no longer trades affection for company. And even if that decision brings long, silent nights, she knows her body is not in abstinence. It is in protection. It is safeguarding sacred space for something that comes not from lack, but from the soul. The transformation is complete when she realizes she no longer needs to be sought. She has become the fire, the center, the source of light. And when that light begins to shine, those who cannot handle its intensity quietly disappear. The ones who come next will not dare to approach her halfway, because the woman who has crossed through silence no longer accepts a dimmed existence. She is no longer available for the ordinary, because she herself is no longer ordinary. And when the body goes quiet, it is the soul that begins to choose. And the soul once awakened never again chooses what once wounded it. She does not rise as someone returning to the world, but as someone who has become the world itself. Every step she takes now is intentional. Every choice is guided not by fear of being alone, but by the profound value of her own company. The body that once held still now vibrates at a different frequency, one that is deeper, truer, and free. She no longer rushes to fill silence or tries to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold her fullness. Carl Jung once said, "What we deny submits us. What we integrate transforms us." And this woman has integrated her absences. She made emptiness her home. She turned silence into a sanctuary. And here is what most people miss. She is not waiting to be rescued. Because the woman who has walked through her own darkness no longer needs saving. She didn't wait to be rescued, she became her own rescue. And in doing so, she crossed a threshold that changed everything. She no longer lives in the old cycle of need. What once felt like hunger is now discernment. What used to be emotional dependency has evolved into sacred self-awareness. Love, when it finds her, will no longer be a remedy for emptiness. It will be an extension of fullness, a companion to her completeness. Because her soul no longer seeks to be filled, it already overflows. With this shift comes a deeper clarity. She begins to see that her personal transformation holds a greater meaning. Her silence, once misunderstood, becomes a symbol for the silence of countless women who were taught to shrink to please, to disappear. Now, she doesn't want to guide others. She wants to ignite something in them. Because only someone who has been through the dark can teach others how to walk through it without fear. Jung would say she is no longer trying to be accepted by the world. She is expressing her truth regardless of it. What she lost no longer haunts her. The versions of herself that once begged for love, bent to fit in, or dimmed to stay close, she mourned them, but she no longer misses them. Every loss now feels like a layer removed. Every goodbye, a doorway opened. She has found something richer than romance soul nourishment. A depth that feeds her in places no touch ever could. She no longer waits for someone to complete her. She no longer entertains shallow connections just to feel alive. Her energy, once scattered in seeking, now gathers inward like a sacred fire. She walks not to impress, not to attract, but to align. Her body, once misunderstood, is no longer quiet. In absence, it is quiet in devotion. Devotion to her path, to her truth, to her wholeness. And when desire returns, it will not come from loneliness or longing. It will come as sacred choice, as embodiment of love, not the escape from lack. She is not preparing to fit into an old role again. She's building something new. A space where her voice matters, where her silence is honored, and her presence speaks louder than performance. Love, when it arrives, will not find a woman begging for it. It will find a woman who understands herself too deeply to compromise again. Until then, she stands not in longing, but in reverence. Still, rooted, listening. The body is no longer loud, but the soul has never been more alive. What once seemed like emptiness has revealed itself to be sacred preparation. The silence was never emptiness, it was gestation. And now the world that once told her she was too quiet begins to feel her vibration everywhere. She needs no spotlight to glow. She needs no validation to exist. Her journey was never about escape. It was about embodiment. She no longer wears the masks of survival. She radiates from the truth of arrival. This is not a pause. It's a rebirth. Her story doesn't end with stillness. It begins there. And if something in you stirred while listening, that is not coincidence. That is recognition. The feeling that you no longer belong where you once did, that something deeper is calling you back home. That is the soul speaking. Maybe this message was never meant to explain, but to awaken. And if it awakened something in you, don't walk away from that spark. Let it expand. Share it with someone else who's searching in silence. Tell us what you're remembering. And if you feel called to journey further into this space, subscribe and stay with us. Because here, every silence is honored. Every word is intentional. And every awakening begins with a single whisper you finally dare to hear. You are not broken. You are becoming.